Vice is a biopic of former Vice President Dick Cheney, who served during George W. Bush's two presidencies from 2001 to 2009.
Well, George, I'm the CEO of a large company. And I have been Secretary of Defense. And I have been White House Chief of Staff. The Vice Presidency is a mostly symbolic job. However, if we came to a different understanding, I can handle the more mundane jobs, overseeing bureaucracy, military, energy, and foreign policy. Yeah, right. I like that.
Endowing Cheney with executive powers, Bush rendered him the most powerful vice president in the US history. He was behind the war on terror after September 11 attacks and the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and the approval of the illegal surveillance programs and the legalization of torture of terror suspects, or what he called enhanced interrogation.
Bush approved all of this?
Nope.
He's a villain to some of us and a hero to others. You as a filmmaker, you have the task to bring a new perspective. How do you do it? Where do you start?
He seemed like a very far away, shadowy question mark to me. Whereas with George W. Bush, you can kind of see who he is pretty quickly. And I really wanted to understand who this guy was, this guy that really shook the foundations of history. And I wanted to see him as a young man. I wanted to see him as a guy who's a father with daughters and a wife that he loves. And I think it's very important that we understand these people and understand that they're not just mythic figures that are good or bad.
The film begins in Wyoming, 1963, when drunk Cheney is pulled over by police officers. A reprimand from his wife ensues.
You stand up straight, and you have the courage to become someone, or I'm gone.
Then it leaps to 1969, when he begins working for Nixon's economic advisor, Donald Rumsfeld, and gradually climbs up the ladder of power in the US government and becomes President Ford's chief of staff. Then he serves as a congressman before he is appointed as a defense secretary by George Bush Sr. and oversees the first Gulf War. During the Clinton administration, he retreats from politics to oil business, until he's called back by Bush Jr. to join him in the 2000 presidential elections. In spite of presenting Cheney as a loving husband and a caring father, the film leaves the audience with the impression that he was a greedy, power-hungry opportunist who has no principles. He ran on a platform where he promised to do these bad things. So his supporters were expecting him to do what we perceive as bad.
Well, I mean, he didn't say that he was going to invade Iraq after 9/11. That obviously
the support
happened.
of over 90% of the nation.
90% of the nation was supporting George Bush after 9/11. And then eventually he got the nation to 70% of the nation believing that Saddam Hussein was connected to 9/11. A lot of that was through misinformation. I mean, I think what happened was, W. Bush and Cheney portrayed themselves as calm professionals, moderates. And then, this great catastrophe happened, 9/11. And I think what we didn't realize that was Dick Cheney was a very different guy than, he had portrayed himself. So suddenly he was in this incredible opportunity to change government, to change the role of the vice president, history. It's a crazy story, there's no question.
This is clearly Al-Qaeda. Iraq has all the good targets.
Let's get the president back online soon.
Neither branch has oversight of the VP.
How do you think his supporters will view the movie then? Would they change their mind about him? Would they start thinking, oh, maybe he did bad things?
You know what's funny? I've always said that if you're really one of his supporters, or if you're a Republican, you really shouldn't have a problem with any of this. I mean, it's sort of the story of the Reagan Revolution. It worked. They changed this country. The Heritage Foundation, the Koch brothers, all of it, it worked. So, yeah, there's a little bit of a tone in the end, I guess, that gets a bit tragic. But other than that, I would think if you supported Dick Cheney, you would have no problem with it.
The film shows horrific torture scenes and hideous war images. But McKay applies his surreal comedy in telling this dark story. using playful editing, sarcastic voiceover, and fourth wall breaking. How do you feel about humorizing, for instance, in this movie, torture?
I don't think there's ever a moment where we're ever funny around that subject. I think there's moments in the movie that we're playful with, but never, ever would we do anything that was humorous with torture.
So why do you think humor and how humor is effective in conveying the message you're trying to communicate to audience?
You know, these guys are very ridiculous. They're very obvious with what they do. George W. Bush, Cheney, I mean, there's a part of us that I think should laugh at them. I think it takes away some of their power. But then there's another part of it that's very dark and tragic. And I think one of the tricks with this movie was trying to show both those sides, you know, that there is a side that we should be very solemn about and sad about. But at the same time, we also should be able to laugh at these characters.
McKay wrote comedies before directing movies such as The Anchorman, The Legend of Ron Burgundy, in which he mocked the broadcast media. The Step Brothers, in which he warned from privilege toxicity, and The Other Guys, a harsh critique of the financial sector.
What?
In 2015, he applied his surrealist comedy to expose the culprits behind the 2008 financial crash in The Big Short, which garnered him the Oscar for Best Adapted Screenplay. In The Big Short, you showed us other morally bad side of some people, the bankers. How different are they from Cheney? Do you view them similarly, morally at least?
It's a great question. I think it's easy for us to get lost in our job. I think it's easy for us to just day in, day out, 9 to 5, do what we do. The people around us do it. It seems normal. It seems commonplace. And in that sense, it's an interesting comparison to draw between the bankers and Dick Cheney. Because I think it's one of those things where just day in, day out, there's a giant institution that supports what you're doing. No one is screaming or pointing at you. It just seems like it's normal.
So are they both a product of the system, rather than, as you said, they were not born bad?
I do. I believe that these systems that we're dealing with in the modern world are so complicated. And I think there are forces that are unleashed by them that we don't quite understand. I mean, if you really look at it, you know, how long ago did we really get democracy? What is it, 250 years ago, 300 years ago? Let's even call it 350 years ago. That's nothing. I still think we're figuring this out.
Yeah, right on this, are we?
What really stands out in Vice is performances. Christian Bale's transformation as Cheney, or Sam Rockwell as Bush Jr., and Amy Adams as Lynn Cheney. Deservedly, they all got Oscar nominations.
What I told them basically in the beginning was, I said, don't feel like you have to do an impression. Psychologically, I want you to put these people together in a way that's very honest. But I think what happens when you get actors that are this good, they just went so deep into them. It was kind of startling when I saw them really pull these characters together. I had the same reaction. I had the hair stand up on my arm.
But they said, for instance, none of them met the real characters.
Yeah?
As a director, weren't you concerned that they miss a proper reflection of those characters?
You know, it was a tricky thing. I mean, we obviously knew that none of these characters would be, they wouldn't be too thrilled with a movie being made. But ordinarily, you would have the actors meet the people. We were lucky in this case because there's so much tape. There's so many interviews with these characters that are out there that luckily the actors had an endless source of material they could look at. And then, there's a lot of people that know the Cheneys that we were able to talk to, obviously off the record, but they were able to get personal details. I know that Christian Bale had hours and hours of tape, and he found every little physical idiosyncrasy that you could ever have with Cheney.
We can make this work.
Hot damn.
Vice failed to impress the critics or attract cinema goers, but it found love in Hollywood, where it was recently nominated to 8 Oscars, 3 of which went to McKay: Best Picture, Best Director, and Best Original Screenplay. Sam Asi, BBC,